Good afternoon, and welcome to today's program titled Seamless EHR Transition Through Data Migration. I'm Heather Landy, Assistant Editor of Healthcare Informatics. Today's program is sponsored by Galen Healthcare. Thank you to our sponsor and to our audience for giving us your time and attention. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping details. Each window on your screen can be moved by clicking and dragging, or enlarged and minimized by clicking the icons in the top right corner of each window. Please use the Q&A area to the right of the slides to submit a question at any time. If you cannot see this area, simply click the red Q&A button. To download a copy of today's presentation, please click the link in the resources area in the lower left of your screen. If you have any technical issues during the program, please click the yellow help button to troubleshoot the issue. Finally, you can also tweet during today's webinar. Click on the blue Twitter icon at the bottom of your screen and click the Post and Authorize buttons to log into your Twitter account and begin sharing automatically at the event hashtag #HIT-Live-Webinar. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. John Ward is Chief Information Officer for TriHealth. He oversees day-to-day information services for the Cincinnati-based hospital system and leads planning to chart corporate strategy for information services. Ward spent 10 of his last 11 years working for TriHealth or Group Health, a subsidiary. Sherry Monteleone is Network and Support Manager, Information Systems at Citizens Memorial Hospital and has 35 years of IT experience. Sherry has worked with Citizens Memorial Hospital since 2000, assisting with the award-winning implementation of the Meditech system in multiple acute, long-term care, and clinic settings. Mary Ellen Ford is a project management contractor working with the Kentucky Health Information Exchange, which provides a common, secure electronic communication infrastructure to exchange health information within the Commonwealth and across its borders. John, Sherry, and Mary Ellen are also joined by Ray Lape and Julia Snap of Galen. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to speak with us today, and with that, the audience is yours.
Great, thanks, Heather. Hello and welcome to everyone. This is Ray Lape from Galen Healthcare. And just to give you a quick rundown of the agenda today, we've already done welcome and introductions. Next, we'll do a little bit of background around data migrations from our perspective here at Galen Healthcare. And then we'll dive into our panelist stories around their data migration projects, and we'll wrap up with some panel discussion and Q&A from the audience. Next slide, please. So we've got a great panel of speakers today. I want to quickly get to their stories, but first wanted to set the stage with some of the background information around data migrations and really our approach to EHR data migrations based on our experience here at Galen. Certainly an EHR transition consists of many key components that really all contribute to the success of that transition, beginning with the initial thought of a transition and a vigorous vendor selection process. Certainly upon selecting that vendor, there's starting the planning of the implementation and starting to go through an assessment of what data that you will be migrating. So while the internal team is focused on the implementation, there's generally a gap in support for the legacy application that needs to be filled so that those providers and staff are not left behind until the cutover. Leading up to that cutover, there'll be a time period where you'll be going through that data migration of some sort. And with where everyone is today, and most folks are on an electronic system and accustomed to having that data really at their fingertips, in my opinion, the data migration has really become one of the biggest keys to success in the transition. Being able to smoothly transition providers onto a new system and have all that clinical data for continuity of care at their fingertips is really key to minimizing any productivity loss and really increasing overall satisfaction with the new system. Today's webinar will really focus on that data migration aspect. And then the last thing to really consider in your transition is that archival strategy and what you're going to do for retaining a full legal medical record for your legacy systems once you cut over to the new system. Next slide, please. Certainly there are many different approaches to data migration, but in general there are really three main elements from our perspective that really contribute to a successful data migration. It really starts with the people. Having the right team of people in with the right experience is undoubtedly probably the most important aspect. Many organizations either haven't really gone through a migration previously, or if they have, the experience is pretty limited. Maybe they had gone through one in the past based on an acquisition or something like that. But it's important to have folks that are helping with your migration and that are really used to handling a migration on a day-to-day basis, and really know what to expect and what to look out for. There's a lot of complexity that goes into the data migration. There's a lot of details to keep track of. Secondly, it really is having that tried and true process or methodology that you follow when executing your data migration. Certainly that's also something that is built up over experience, and it's a process that is generally tweaked over time. Lastly, having the right platform or the right technology to meet the many demands that may come up during a data migration is really going to allow you to accomplish a lot more in your data migration. Provide just an example of what I mean there. Here at Galen, we have a data migration platform that we use in all of our data migrations, and something that often comes up in our migrations is migrating data via a CCD. Today, every EMR is really capable of creating a CCD, but unfortunately, very few have an easy ability to export them in bulk, and each one is slightly different depending on the EMR that it may have come from, and sometimes there's certain key elements that may be missing that are important for a data migration. So we use our platform to take the discrete data from an EMR, stage it in our platform, and then we create a very robust standard CCD from the platform that in the end provides a much richer data migration experience for things like problems, medications, and allergies. And it's really a CCD that was built for the specific purpose of a data migration as opposed to interoperability. Next slide, please. Prior to starting your data migration, you'll go through that assessment process that I talked about to really identify what data you want to convert and what's most critical for continuity of care, really based on how well data was captured in the legacy system. What is your timeline, and what is the organization determined as critical for continuity of care? You'll take all of that and make a determination about what data elements to migrate and really how many years of data that you're going to want to migrate. While going through this process, it's really important to make sure to separate that need for continuity of care versus that need for retaining a legal medical record. We focus on the continuity of care from a migration perspective, while for legal medical record, we focus on an archive strategy. You certainly want to shut down those legacy systems and save that associated cost, but you're really not going to be able to migrate everything to retain your legal medical record. So this is where the need for an archiving strategy comes into place. Next slide, please. Along the lines of the archiving strategy, Galen actually does offer archival services via Vital Center Online. This is a solution that really allows you to legally decommission those legacy systems, retain all of your legacy data in one easily accessible location that can be gotten to via a single sign-on from your new EMR. It's a secure and reliable solution that's going to enable you to support those future requests for records or audit reporting that might be required by HIPAA. If you could go to the next slide, Julia is going to take over here and walk us through some of the specifics about the data migration project, starting off with those data elements you might consider for continuity of care.
Thanks, Ray. As Ray mentioned earlier, our recommendation is to only migrate elements that support continuity of care. These are the typical data elements that we have supported in our data migration projects. The rest of the data can be archived to support the legal requirements of maintaining the data for however many years necessary. In addition to focusing on continuity of care, your organization's timeline and budget will also drive what can be migrated. Our technology allows organizations to tailor the data elements and the scope of the data to best meet their needs. A recent example of this is that a client wanted a full history of all active allergies, administered immunizations, active medications, and active problems. They also wanted 10 years of procedure and office visit notes, but wanted us to filter out nurse and telephone notes. For vital signs, they wanted the last height and weight readings for adult patients. However, they wanted all height, weight, and head circumference readings for pediatric patients to populate on growth charts. As I mentioned earlier, there are other data elements that can be migrated as part of a migration project. However, these have been the most common. Next slide, please. Our typical migration timeline can range anywhere from 4 months to as long as 2 years. The timeline is primarily driven based on the new EHR's go-live date, as well as the scope for the data migration. Our methodology is 8 phases. I won't go into the detail of each of the phases, but I will call out the most critical ones. The first phase of our methodology focuses on extracting and evaluating the legacy system data. We apply lessons learned from past migration projects to identify any areas of risk as early on in the project as possible. We are looking for the data to ensure that it will display correctly in the new EHR. A recent example of this is when we were evaluating how medication information was being stored in the legacy system. We found that the legacy system was not correctly storing the prescribed dose in the database. It was only storing the strength of the medication. So we had to work with the client to determine the safest way to convert the data without populating misleading or incorrect information into the new EHR. The second phase is around data mapping. Next slide, please. Our process is to map each legacy dictionary value to its corresponding value in the new EHR. We keep the end users in mind when making these mapping decisions, as we want the converted data to look and act like it would if it was created in the new EHR after go live. A good example of this is around document type mapping. Someone may be quick to build one-to-one document types between the legacy and new EHR. However, you really want to understand how, in this example, a well-child note will be created in the new EHR and map it accordingly. This is important so providers can easily find what they're looking for, and they don't have to first try and figure out if the data was converted to then use a different method to look for the data. Next slide, please. The next phases are our testing and validation phases. The reason why I want to call these out is because they typically require the most time and effort. There are 3 phases: small, large, and full-scale validation. Each phase has its own purpose and set of goals. Full-scale validation is truly a dress rehearsal for go live. We extract all of the data that's in scope, transform it into its proper format, and then load it into the new EHR. We time each step so we understand how long each piece will take. Once the data has been loaded, we get a better understanding if any build is missing from the new EHR, how long it took for the messages to process, and what errors may have occurred. This gives the project team time to address and resolve any issues before we load into production. The final phase of our conversion methodology is our go-live support phase. In addition to providing standard support, many times this phase is also to support when the legacy system has been switched to read-only. Many organizations decide to leave the legacy system up and running for a specific amount of time after the new EHR's go-live date, primarily to allow providers to finish any documentation, review results, and perform charge entry. Once the legacy system is switched to read-only, we will provide a gap or catch-up load to sync the data between the 2 systems. Next slide, please. Now it's time to hand over the presentation to our presenters. They will give an overview of their organization and data migration project, an example of a challenge or success, and any lessons learned that they hope you'll be able to benefit from. Please go to the next slide, and we'll turn it over to our first panelist, John Ward, CIO for TriHealth, to share his story.
Good afternoon. Thank you for asking me to present today. So TriHealth is a 6-hospital system in Southwest Ohio. This specific project Galen helped us with was a acquisition we made of a small community-based hospital in Oxford, Ohio. We have worked with Galen on several different occasions doing data migrations from different systems. The unique thing about this specific hospital is we encountered an EMR that we had not encountered before in all the acquisitions we've been doing, and we had done a ton of acquisitions over several years. And in this situation, they had a product by the name of CPSI in place, and we needed to be able to port all the data from CPSI to our enterprise-wide EMR, Epic. So getting data out of CPSI was challenging. Galen wasn't familiar with CPSI, but they were able to propose a solution that we were able to execute and on an expedited timeline. Galen showed their expertise in pulling the data out of this unknown system. The scope of the migration projects vary often between acute and ambulatory due to patient acuity. In addition to providing suggestions on which data elements should be abstracted or converted, Galen also helped to identify the best source of the data and process to migrate that data. For example, migrating data directly from an LIS system and cutover planning to manually migrate specific data for in-house patients. So when you looked at this project, what were our real factors of success? Well, the project management was huge. Having a project manager that provide expertise on data migrations was important, but also the fact that the project manager was familiar with the EMR that we were moving to was also a big help. Also, Galen had the ability to get the data out of CPSI and transform it into the format that we needed to have so that Epic could take it in, and that was a big deal and a lot of effort. Galen understands how Epic works, as I mentioned. They were able to give us suggestions on how to best map the data. They didn't just build one-to-one entries for what existed in the legacy system, which was important. And finally, I would add, it is critical when you're looking at doing a project like this, you need to have a partner that can adjust as needed. We've done several different data conversion projects with Galen, as I mentioned, and things come up. Anytime you're doing a project like this, things come up. Earlier, Julia talked about the different types of testing you do, and as you're going through that testing, you're going to discover things that are a little unusual, and you're going to have to make decisions, make adjustments in your coding, and reload your data, et cetera, and do additional testing. And having a true partner and not just a contractor is important so that the two of you can work together very quickly to address those situations, make adjustments, and load the data as needed. So overall, in our situation with CPSI, it was an extremely successful project. These projects take a long time. You've got to be very diligent. You've got to go through the details and make sure that it's all accurate. And you've got to make sure that you have those that are going to use the system after the fact involved in your testing so that you get a really good understanding whether you've gotten everything and is it accurate? Is the quality there? Julia?
Great. Thanks, John. Appreciate the insight there. Certainly one thing I'll say is with a condensed timeline such as that project had, it's definitely critical that the folks that we're working with from the client organization are engaged and focused and easy to work with, and certainly the team at TriHealth has always been amazing to work with, and enables us to really feel as part of the team there. So always enjoy those projects. If you would please go to the next slide, and we will turn it over to Sherry to tell us a little bit about her story.
Thank you, Ray. This is Sherry Monteleone, and I work at Citizens Memorial Hospital in Bolivar, Missouri. We use Meditech Client Server 5.67 in the acute, ambulatory, long-term care, and home care market for a fully integrated medical record. So our conversion story basically was the end of 2014, and I want everybody to remember 2014 because CCDs were very new. No one had to use them yet. You know, we didn't have the integration options that we do today. But anyway, we acquired a very successful family practice clinic that had been on our campus for years. The unusual thing is that we are paperless, and they were paperless and had been using Allscripts for 7 years. So it wasn't like some of the other, conversions and acquisitions we'd done in the past where you acquire a clinic and just get a bunch of their boxed records and maybe scan in some send-out set. You know, they wanted to keep all of their data, and we really liked them and wanted it to be win-win for everybody. So first thing that we did is basically we looked at the patient subsets, and about 80% of their patients were already in our system. We didn't have an inbound ADT feed, so we ended up scripting those 20% of the patients in that didn't exist into our system, and basically this was, ambulatory to ambulatory for conversion. Once we had all of the patients in our system, then we looked at, what data we needed to bring over. And like John said, Galen was an awesome partner helping us with this because we'd never done anything on this scale. We brought in the CCDs, and we felt like that was a way that we could basically get that external medical summary, the one summary document, as well as discrete problems, allergies, and medications. We were the first Meditech site to actually import in CCDs in any kind of batch fashion and end up with those discrete values. Galen was very good helping us with the CCDs because like I think Julia mentioned before, there really was not a real standard with CCDs, even though the government thinks there is. The Allscripts CCD definitely would not file into Meditech, and both vendors said that theirs was standard. So Galen helped us reformat those. We removed the data that we were going to bring in discretely so that we did not basically make the CCD too verbose. And we actually ended up also pulling some things like vitals out into discrete notes that were included in the CCD. This family practice clinic had patients that had a 7-year record, and they delivered babies, and they also do long-term care. So the very first CCD we brought into the system was, I think, 46 pages long. That's when we figured out we had to send that out and make it valuable. Then we looked at our HL7 options, and we wanted to bring in their lab. We didn't have an inbound HL7 lab feed by default, but we figured out that we did have what is called a point of care lab interface, and it's where your glucometers and iStats and Roche devices all file unsolicited lab results. So we were able to basically disconnect that from that lab system and put it on the interface engine and bring all their lab in through that. And one thing I would say on that is that we were very careful with all these conversion documents to maintain the provenance of the data. So, we wanted to look at the EMR and basically know that this value came in through this conversion, and in the note maybe that it originated at Quest and then ended, which is a contract lab in our area, and was, ordered by a certain doctor, and that in their Allscripts system, they said this test was XYZ, but we're filing it as XYZ.1. So we tried to keep that provenance on everything. Then we had all of the notes that we brought in, and basically, with Galen's help, decided what data needed to be brought in discreetly. We were able to bring some of those in through HL7, and then a big bunch of them we were able to basically import in via kind of a cold feed. But the nice thing is that they did they do appear discreetly in the EMR, and you know they were brought in as part of this conversion project. So, you know, we couldn't have done it without them. We did not have Allscripts experience. And one thing I will say is they were very good at really focusing on this with us. And I would tell everybody to just give yourself a short time frame, keep your momentum, dedicate some people to it, and get it done. So that's our story.
Great. Thanks, Sherry. I know we've got a theme of some expedited timelines here. I know this one was a quick one. I remember the team cranking away over that Christmas and New Year's break, and same with you. You and your team were always great to work with. So I'll say those projects in which that true team is created, regardless of whose works for who, everybody's focused on the same goals, are certainly the most successful. So if we could go to the next slide, please, we'll turn it over to Mary Ellen to tell us a little bit about her story.
Thanks, Ray. This is Mary Ellen. And I guess before I get started with my story, what I'd like to say is this webinar would have been amazing to have had when we kicked off our project. This is a huge service provided by Galen Healthcare, as well as healthcare informatics. So this is huge. So hopefully the folks who are attending are taking great notes, because this is really incredible information from the stories and from Julie and Ray so far. So a little bit about the organization that I worked with. It's located here in Kentucky, and they're the largest not-for-profit system in Kentucky. They have over 300 points of care, and they provide care across the state in 39 counties, 6 in Illinois, and 6 counties in southern Indiana. So pretty widespread as far as lives covered. There are 9 hospitals. One was very recently acquired, and another is managed. Their physician network is comprised of over 3,000 employed and affiliated physicians. And as you can imagine, that number continues to grow. So with that organization, I worked most recently there as an Epic program manager. And during their Epic implementation, I was responsible for their patient load, electronic clinical data conversion, as well as the change management program. So they did choose Epic as its new system. And the scope of work for it included 7 hospitals and all owned ambulatory entities. The implementation was really designed as a rollout across the markets, with essentially ambulatory going live a few months ahead of the hospitals within that particular market. Allscripts Enterprise EHR, formerly known as TouchWorks, was implemented in that system back in 2012, so it was pretty new to that organization, and it was in 190 sites and used by over 300 providers. The organizations, it was set up on a single platform, and so there was 4 different Allscripts orgs set up to separate those different markets. So again, we're talking about that many-to-one ratio, many different many-to-one relationship there when you're talking about going to a single platform like Epic. While working with the Epic Physicians Council regarding the scope of work for conversions, it was really clear that the data from Allscripts EHR was very important to them, as you can imagine. It almost gets personal when you're working with the providers on that scope of work. At Go Live, they really wanted to see the Allscripts encounters, the electronic notes, the meds, allergies, and problems. And what I can say is a challenge that we discussed real early on was, the quality of that data in that existing system. So in one market, they might have cleaner problems than another market. Although when we moved this over, we made the decision to move it. It was going to be all or none. So ultimately, they decided having the data was better than not having the data. So luckily, they chose to go ahead and move that data to have at their fingertips at Go Live, so they could serve that patient better at that time of transition. So after working with some in-house team members and with my core conversion team, it was clear we didn't have the expertise to pull the data from Allscripts. So my conversions team lead luckily found Galen, and we had several discovery calls with them. I did check their 3 client references before moving forward with a contract execution, and so glad that I did that. It was almost too good to be true from the references, so luckily we went ahead and partnered with Galen, and they filled our gap perfectly. They knew all scripts, and this is something that has been a common thread with the other 2 stories as well. They knew all scripts, but they also knew Epic. So having both was amazing, because we really didn't know either that well in-house in terms of the database piece. So it was a huge win. Our team ultimately was able to deliver net more than what was requested. So it was a win in a big way. We included immunization and vitals in addition to what they had already requested. The meds, allergies, and problems were delivered to Epic via CCD. As John mentioned earlier, they have, when I say they, Galen has this really cool CCD delivery tool that surpasses anything that Allscripts CCD could have done, so that it maps and files really cleanly into the Epic record. So the providers were very impressed. And when I say impressed, they used words like, wow, that's cool. I mean, they were blown away when we did some validation with them, when we finally had some data to show them in the Epic system, testing system. They were impressed with the quality of the converted Allscripts data at Go Live too. We could tell that pretty swiftly from the command center tickets that weren't coming in. So silence is golden, as you can imagine, when you're going through a Go Live situation like that, with so many ambulatory sites going live at the same time per market. As I recall, there were only a few mapping changes that we made post Go Live, so very, very minor, and that just speaks volumes to all the hard work that went into the project building up to Go Live. This positive outcome, in my opinion, would not have been possible without our partnership with Galen Healthcare, namely Julia Snap and Taylor Meyer, our primary contacts for our project. Their organization, professionalism, and expertise really attributed to the success of our Allscripts conversion project. Thank you, and that is my story.
Great. Thank you, Mary Ellen. Appreciate the insight there and the kind words. I'll echo the great team that we worked with there as well. You and your team on that project, the big key to the success there. So I think that rounds out our panelist stories, and we'll move on into the panel discussion. Heather, I think you've got a quick note to make, and we'll move on.
Yes, thank you, Sherry, Mary Ellen, and John, once again for a very informative presentation. We've had some questions that have come in from the audience. However, we would like to remind our audience to use the Q&A widget to the right of the slides on your screen to submit a question at any time. And now I will hand it back over to Ray to start the discussion.
Great, thanks, Heather. So the first question here to John, and John, you probably spoke a little bit about this already, but you talk about really what the key drivers were for that EMR transition and the data migration there at your organization?
Yeah, thanks, Ray. So, as I mentioned earlier, this was an acquisition in the Oxford, Ohio. This is where Miami University is, and that hospital services that community as well as Miami. So they have, as you can imagine, they've got a large population of people that are turnover regularly in that space. And so having access to their medical record information was very important. Also, from a TriHealth perspective, we have, is part of our overall strategy to have everyone using a single EMR and being able to follow standard care practices using best practices within that EMR across the enterprise. So it was an easy decision that to make that we needed to move them to Epic off of CPSI. But what really drove the data migration is we did not want to go through any kind of abstraction and input process, some sort of manual transition of the data. And so what drove the data migration was the need to make sure that when we did the big bang cutover at that hospital, that all of the data from their previous EMR CPSI was readily available and accessible, and the providers had access to everything they needed to treat that population in that marketplace. So that was the main reasons that we moved them, one, to Epic, and why we did a data conversion.
Great, thanks, John. The next question here we'll throw to Sherry. Sherry, can you tell us, have the providers witnessed the positive impact from the migration in their day-to-day operations, and if so, how?
They have, and I think Mary Ellen spoke to it. It is very personal to them. You know, like I said, this was a busy practice. It's family practice. The 7 years worth of data they had might be a young mom that's had 3 babies they've delivered. So we like these guys, and they liked us, and there were very high expectations for this migration. You know, we just couldn't ask them to move off of their paperless, very nice ambulatory system onto ours without a successful migration. So it was really very personal. There was a very small subset of records, I think 50 records out of almost 40,000, that we could not import the CCD for some technical reason. And I think it was size of the CCD or something. And I would never have imagined that they actually would run across one of those records and know that it didn't get migrated, because we queued all these CCDs up so that the minute that they saw the patient the next time, it would show, hey, there are external, you know, problems, allergies, and medications, and here's their external medical summary. But I immediately got a call from one of the doctors and said, hey, I'm seeing patient XYZ. Where is their CCD? I don't see any of their external data. So, you know, it was really important to them, something they used every day, and important to the community. You know, we had even a lot of our own employees were patients over there, and it was a big deal. You know, they had a portal, like I said, a successful system, and for that to all get converted over to Meditech seamlessly in our patient portal to have all of the correct data was a big deal.
Great, thanks again, Sherry. So we'll share the love here. We'll throw the next question to Mary Ellen. Mary Ellen, what was the most critical aspect of your data migration project?
Thanks, Ray. So validation. If I could sound like a real estate agent, I'd say validation, validation, validation. Like they say, location, location, location. That's huge, and that's a part of the project that isn't entirely clear if you've never done one before. So I firmly believe that your electronic conversion is only as successful as your weakest validator. When mapping the data, it's critical to have a group of folks who understand it and can review it in the legacy system and compare it to the destination system, which in our case was Epic. So for this organization, you know, the validators of the Allscripts data, they typically had a role like an EMR trainer, essentially. So they understood the Allscripts system very well and the data that it contained. And they could swiftly identify then issues if it didn't appear correctly in Epic. Galen was great and provided those validation scripts that we used for that effort. To mark the data elements as pass-fail, and then comments for issues needing additional research. But if there's anything you take away from what part of this project is going to attribute to the greatest success, first of all, include Galen in your project, and number 2, make sure you engage those validation resources early and at the critical milestones as part of your project.
Thanks, Mary Ellen. All right. So we got some more questions here. Keep them coming. We'll take this one. back to John. How did the data migration contribute to the success of the overall transition for your organization?
Well, I kind of talked about this earlier with the other question, but to reiterate, this project would not have been successful without the data migration. Again, when we did this project at this hospital in Oxford, we not only changed out their EMR, we changed out every system they had, from payroll to their HR systems, etc., their PAC system. We changed over their lab, everything. And it was critical because we did this in a big bang, and it was critical that all the data that the providers needed, as well as the clinical staff needed to provide care on the next day after this big bang, it had to be there. And they did not want to have to work out of a separate system. So without doing this data migration, this project would not have been a success. And with to reiterate some of the other speakers' comments, if we would not have done the level of validation that we did with the customer, making sure that the customer was involved in that validation process to make sure the data was accurate and it met their need and we didn't have any gaps in our data and so on, it wouldn't have been successful. And back to what I said earlier, the fact that when we did find something during that validation that we could adjust and make changes and very quickly address it, that too was extremely important. So again, it would not have been a successful project without that data migration, right?
Great answers, John. Appreciate it. Appreciate everybody's answers here. Keep the questions coming. Sherry, we'll send this one to you. What technical challenges were encountered during the project, and how did the team innovate to overcome them?
Oh, that's a great question. We had lots of technical challenges. You know, we didn't own, like I said, the ADT interface, so we ended up inbound to ADT, so we ended up having to script in some of the patients. There isn't an inbound immunization or vital signs, unsolicited vital signs interface, or at least there wasn't one available with Meditech at the time. And it was before everybody was having to submit immunizations to the state registry. So, you know, we wished those two pieces would come in discreetly, and I'm jealous of Mary Ellen because I think they got that done. We ended up having to basically drop those into a note with a specific name and file them that way. So at least you could see, you know, if you look in the EMR under other reports, you see the clinic name, you see, you know, whether it's vital signs, immunization, nurse's notes, whatever, and then you see, you know, that it was brought over with the conversion. We repurposed a couple of existing inbound HL7 interfaces. One of them was for inbound text-based reports, and one was for lab. And figured out, you know, we were so tickled with ourselves that we could get this to work, and then figured out that somehow we're going to have to throttle that migration data coming in so that the production data wasn't delayed. So we ended up having to kind of write a couple of scripts that said, you know, bring in these millions of, you know, discrete HL7 lab results with this production interface, but only bring in a certain amount of them every few minutes so we're not delaying any real-time lab results. The mapping was a big deal, and you would think that even in 2014 there would be more standard nomenclature, but kind of like Mary Ellen had said with the validation, the mapping is an onerous task. I mean, and you've got to have clinical people involved, and Galen was great to help with that and provide these giant spreadsheets where basically you say, you called it an active, we called it, you know, you called it a CBC, we called it a CBC.1, whatever, and you map, and things like, you know, their system maybe would allow alpha characters in a field and ours was numeric only. Theirs would maybe allow blank and ours wasn't. So there's just lots of mapping to be done. So Galen was a huge help for us with basically the project management, kind of giving us some best practices and not getting mad at us whenever we came back, after trying something, figuring out it didn't work or we had made the wrong choice. So they were great partners.
Great. Thanks, Sherry. So we got a lot of questions coming in here, and I don't know we'll get to all of them, but we will try to follow up afterwards with some answers to these if we don't get to them. The next question, just keep going in the order here for now. Mary Ellen, what tools or resources were deployed to address that clinical item mapping for you?
Thanks, Ray. I would say the key really is having the right people on the calls when discussing the mappings. So we had a physician dedicated to the EPIC project Tuesday through Friday. He actually practiced in his home clinic on Mondays. And luckily, he was also an end user of Allscripts, so that helped a lot. So he provided input on those calls. He wasn't always on them, but we would try to tap his shoulder, especially when it came to certain pieces that we were just stumped and it wasn't incredibly obvious what it should be. So he really kind of was our ultimate approver of those mappings, but ultimately when we were just in a snag situation, it's really vital to have the right people included in order to make those decisions swiftly and or to just get recommendations from them as well. So in addition to my conversions team lead who loaded the converted data, we also included the EPIC ambulatory analyst is also a really key person to have working on those. Ultimately, they're ones serving as the liaison between the EPIC team who may be building it and those validators who actually know the data really well. So she served as a really important role in that mapping process. And so she was always on those weekly calls, and if she wasn't, we would reschedule because we wouldn't really get very far without that particular analyst. Galen, a.k.a. Julia, created our artifacts for mapping that data. She was amazing. She got us to a canvas that had paint on it already, if you can follow my artistic analogy. It's really daunting to start with a blank canvas and start from scratch when it comes to that. And we kind of did that in other areas of our conversion effort because honestly, for those of you who have worked with EPIC, I mean, when it comes to conversions, they don't hand off much to you in the way of templates or anything. You kind of start from scratch. So once you've gone through the user web and haven't found anything that might meet your needs, you're kind of at a standstill. So for our project on the Allscripts conversion to EPIC, Julia was amazing and already basically having a good start. And so basically the rest of our team worked together to refine it. So that model worked extremely well and ultimately yielded the positive results we were after upon go live. Thanks, Ray.
Thanks, Mary Ellen. I'll switch up the order here for a minute because I think this question was probably specifically for Sherry. It came in right after she spoke. But Sherry, was the 3-month timeline only for the migration effort, or was there other time in there for other other parts of the transition?
Nope, that was it. I think they announced the end of September that we were going to acquire that clinic effective January 1st of the following year. So we literally had like 90 days from start to finish to produce. I will say that our team loves a challenge. We perform our best, I think, sometimes whenever we're given an impossible task. And we dedicated some resources to it. We kind of had the best, lab clinical person, and we had the interface engine guy, and, we pulled in the resources. And while some people were working on lab mapping and, bringing HL7 results in through that point of care interface. We had other people looking at the notes and figuring out, what note types we were going to bring over. We had people doing patient matching. Everybody just kind of dropped everything and worked on this. And I had mentioned we work best whenever we don't lose our momentum, and these projects are very detail-oriented. I mean, you've got these huge spreadsheets and decisions that are made along the way, and what's been tested, what's been validated, what's been brought into live, and really, in my mind, you're just better deciding what you're going to do and getting it done. And I will say we never waited one moment for Galen. We had different teams at Galen as well. We had a really awesome lab guy, a really awesome cold feed guy, CCD person, and they were always able to produce within whatever time frame. Every week we had our conference call. We were never waiting on them. So 3 months, I don't know. I don't know if I'd recommend it, but I would recommend doing it in as short amount of time as possible.
Great, thanks.
Maybe
Sherry.
not over the holidays.
Yeah.
Maybe not Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's, but maybe 3 months is okay.
Definitely the dedicated team is critical to those short timelines and divide and conquer. Not quite recommended, but you don't always get the choice necessarily of what that will be. And we've certainly seen it vary based on the scope and the new EM, what is the new EHR, what is the target EHR, and different processes that are in place around those systems as well. So thanks for the feedback there, Sherry. All right. So let's see. Next question here. Mary Ellen, you guys dealt with multiple different systems in your migration.
Yeah.
So could you speak to additional challenges related to multiple source system data conversions?
I sure can. Where to begin? We did do a really big rollout that included both acute care as well as ambulatory. And again, we did a rollout based on market, and so we would do kind of all of it, finish that, and then we'd move to the next market. So it was a pretty well thought out plan, but the source system list was very, very long. So we had 5 of our core hospitals on McKesson Paragon as an HIS system, and then quite a few of those McKesson core products like HLab, StarRad, HPF. Our pathology was in CoPath. We had LabCorp out in our ambulatory clinics, and we had a hospital that had Meditech, and then all of those core ancillary modules within Meditech we converted as well. And then we had our 7th facility, which was also a McKesson shop, although it was a separate instance because they were newly acquired. So you might as well consider them like a whole nother project all by themselves because they had McKesson Star as opposed to Paragon. So the challenge was getting your arms around all that and knowing who you needed to have on your team that could access that data. So let me tell you about a lady down in Madisonville, Kentucky, who was thinking she was going to retire, although they had to have some conversations with her because she was literally the only resource for McKesson Star at that site. So they worked out a plan for her to work a couple of days a week to help us until that facility was live on Epic. So that's just an example. First of all, you just need to know who where your expertise comes from in pulling the data from that source system. So what we found was our resources were scooped up pretty quick because of the Epic project. So a lot of our IT knowledge moved over to the Epic project team, and they weren't going to work on anything else except for Epic. So ROI Healthcare Solutions was one of our partners who provided that legacy support. So we certainly tapped their shoulders quite a bit, and actually they helped secure some contractors for us specifically for the conversion effort, and they were wonderful. And so there's a lot of risk in trying to find people outside of your knowledge base within your organization initially, but finding the right people on a contractor basis is imperative, because these folks have done it before. You want to find people who've already worked on Epic conversion conversion projects, who understand that destination system as well as that core data that they're pulling. So vetting that out early is really important. Once you have worked through your governance structure and those providers have identified the data that they want to see at go live, that's when the hard work starts of trying to make sure you understand the technical feasibility. So one of the best things that we did was we came up with guiding principles for conversions, so we could remind the providers of these key things. Like Julia said early on in this presentation, conversions isn't about recreating your legacy EMR in your destination system. It's about continuity of patient care. So those providers have what they need at the time that they're going live with this new system. So finding those experts is what I would say is the biggest challenge, but you hopefully can find partners to help reduce that risk in making that decision. I had it was a small team, but they were really great and they were very dependable, and ROI Healthcare Solutions was the shop that kind of helped us identify that talent to use. So Galen was one of our, considered one of our experts. So they sat beside these other fellows that I worked with who understood all these other systems, because they'd already done it before. So you never want to, somebody says they're good at database extraction. You want to be able to see the specific applications they've actually done successful conversions, and then you obviously check the references.
Great, thanks, Mary Ellen. Just a few more minutes left. We're going to go with one more question before we wrap it up here. So this one's to you, John. You talked a lot about the drivers for migration and whatnot. Was there ever a cost-benefit analysis done to examine the potential benefits of doing the data migration versus a manual chart abstraction?
Great question, Ray. So as I mentioned earlier, we've done several data conversions. Did we do one specifically for this CPSI conversion? We didn't, but we took a hard look at data conversions early on to determine whether or not it made sense, right, to do it. The first data conversion we did was a practice, about a 12-physician practice, 3 offices, and we looked hard at that time at whether or not it was cost-effective to do a data migration. And what we determined in our analysis is that if we could reduce the time it took for the physician to get to full productivity, then it was worth the money, right? Because that time, and a lot of times when you're going live, whether it's a hospital conversion or an office conversion, you sometimes will limit throughput, so the number of patients going through the process, and that costs. There's a cost to that. And so when we, with CPSI and this hospital and other migration we did, we found that it was definitely worth the money to get those doctors and those clinicians back to full productivity at a quicker pace. Right?
Great, thanks, John. We have, if we could move to the last slide here, we're going to try to wrap up. So before we wrap up, I do want to mention a couple of things. Galen has an upcoming webinar on Friday if you want to join us around really optimizing your migration with an assessment. Please join us. We've also got a knowledge center with probably a lot of information related to some of the questions that came in here. We've got more questions. We'll try to get some final Q&A responses out to all the questions that we didn't get to. Appreciate everyone joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Heather to wrap us up here.
So I want to thank Ray Lape, Julia Snap, Mary Ellen Ford, Sherry Monteleone, and John Ward once again for an excellent presentation. I also would like to thank our sponsor, Galen Healthcare, for making today's program possible. Finally, thank you to our audience for participating today. We hope you'll join us in the future for another Healthcare Informatics webinar. And this concludes today's presentation.